Thank you very much, Deputy President. And I rise to make some comments about the nation's housing nightmare and to give a preview as to why the Coalition is not of the view that prioritising build-to-rent developments is appropriate in any way. Now, we have a massive failure on housing which starts from the basis that the government has presided over the largest growth in population since the 1950s, but at the same time has presided over a collapse in housing completions. So we've gone from an average of 200,000 houses a year under the last Coalition government, and now we're down to 170,000 new houses each year, despite having the largest growth in employment since the 1950s. Then we have a massive growth of regulation. 5,000 new regulations in the last parliament enacted by this government. Now we see the Minister for Housing, Claire O'Neill, and the Productivity Minister and the Treasurer talk about this thicket of regulations. A thicket they talk about. Thicket. It's a very interesting word, a thicket. Now that thicket was put in place by this government, which for 3 years put in place 5,000 new regulations, including 1,500 new regulations in the Treasury and infrastructure portfolios, where housing policy resides. And then we have the CFMEU, given a green light to get back in business, to get back on track, perhaps, and have been given a green light over the weekend to do their worst in New South Wales, and we'll see the CFMEU flags flying atop new apartment builds in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and every time you see a CFMEU flag, you should be thinking to yourself, this is a 30% tax on young people. Young people will pay 30% extra for the mafia and thuggery and corruption of the Labor Party's CFMEU. And then we have perhaps the saddest stats of all to be recited in these chambers this week in Canberra. Homelessness. I quote the ABC. The number of people accessing homelessness services each month has increased by 10% since Labor was elected in May 2022. This has been a disaster. Beyond the boondoggle of the Housing Australia Future Fund, we have more homeless people than ever before, and we are at a decade low in housing completions, despite having the biggest population we've ever had. But what is the priority of this wonderful Labor government? Its priority is to give a big fat tax cut to foreign asset managers so they can come and build houses in Australia. Houses, homes I should say, that Australians will never own, Deputy President. Australians will never own these houses. These are only to be owned by foreign asset managers from any country. They could even be sovereign wealth funds. So that's the starting point. We don't think it's a good idea to prioritise build-to-rent. Now, we actually have no problem with the market deciding, OK, we want to build an apartment building and we're going to have a build-to-rent and we're going to do that. We love the market. We think that's a good idea. Fine, you can do that. But we don't think it needs a tax cut. And this is the problem that the Australian people have now, having had this government for over 3 years, is that the government is completely captured by vested interests that they are personally and financially close to. So they think, because they've been told by their mates, the unions and the big super funds and the property industry, oh, it's a really good idea to give these foreign fund managers a tax cut so they can build houses that people will never own. You know why it's a good idea for them? Because they get to collect the lower taxation and then all the revenue from leasing houses to Australians. Of course, the poor old Australians become serfs to these people, to these corporates, foreign fund managers, sovereign wealth funds, whatever. So this is their priority. This is their priority. After having presided over the greatest housing calamity in Australian history, they want to do this, a tax cut for build-to-rent developments. Now, the superannuation industry is, of course, one of my favourite groups of people, and they said when they were at the Senate inquiry, and in fact I asked them about whether it was a good idea for the super funds to own houses or big institutions. And I said, do you think the Australian people want to rent their house from a super fund? And the super fund executive from the association said, I think they'd be very happy with institutionally owned residential property. Well, I think that they are wrong. I don't think that's what most Australians want. I think Australians want to own their own house. That's what they want. And they don't want this American model. They do not want to see the Americanisation of Australian housing. Now, if you're wondering what I'm talking about is in cities like Atlanta, Charlottesville and Jacksonville, institutional investors own 25, 18 and 21% of the houses. That's the Americanisation of Australian housing that the Labor Party want to bring to this great country. That's what they want. That's their agenda. Houses owned by big super funds and all their mates of the unions. So it doesn't need a tax cut. So if you want to have build to rent, fine, we're okay. But it doesn't need a tax cut. And in fact, Cameron Murray, who's a very interesting economist, told the Senate that we've got the Abu Dhabi Investment Council, who owns the Smith Collective on the Gold Coast, which is 1,251 build-to-rent dwellings. Okay? And he says that it's bizarre that the government want to prioritise and give foreigners a tax cut when they're already doing it here. So we're trying to make it even easier for them. It's crazy. Now, build-to-rent, across the board, in Melbourne's Kensington, in Sydney's Zetland, there are dozens of developments across the country where this is already happening. So I think it's a big problem. And the property industry itself has said, of this legislation brought to you by the Labor Party, that it's probably not going to work anyway. So that's why we're moving in the next sittings, I suspect now, to disallow these regulations, because we need to have an honest conversation with the Australian people about rectifying this situation. It is clear that the only way out of the housing calamity is to build more houses. As I say, if people want to build to rent, fine, but it doesn't require a tax cut. But more broadly, the tradespeople, the builders, the developers, people involved in home building, they will tell you that the supply side needs support from the Commonwealth, and that's where we should be having a debate about that, and also on sensible ways to help tilt the scales for first home buyers. But we're not of the view that the government should be allowed to be a government for vested interests. Our job is to scrutinise this government. That's what the Australian people would expect. And I think the reason this build-to-rent tax concession was held up for a long time in the last parliament was because a lot of others also share the concern that this is a very unusual priority. It would be an unusual priority to most Australians. But when you have a close look at this government and you understand this is a pattern of its behaviour, that it is very dedicated to specific vested interests, then perhaps it is not surprising. But it is not the right priority. It isn't the right priority. And the message it sends, I think, is very culturally jarring, because what it's saying is that the individual Australians are no longer the focus. We're given up on you owning your own house. And the only solutions we have left are where someone else owns your house or you co-own the house with the government. And don't take my word for it. You can take the ABC's data from it, reported in the ABC, on how bad the situation is. To think that a government that has blown so much hot air on housing and that has built so much bureaucracy is presiding over a massive collapse in construction, but is also now presiding over the worst homelessness crisis in history. I mean, what more data do you want to see? And so I'm surprised that someone of the calibre of the minister hasn't been prepared to look at the housing policies that were inherited from the prior minister and to come to the realisation that this is not working. So the government needs to course correct. We'll help them do that, but we will be moving to disallow this very bad law.